My name is Rinta-Perälä. I'm an artist, composer and a filmmaker. I'm here to talk about the house with laughing windows from 1976. I'm talking about the ideas and filmmaking in this film by Pupi Avati. The research I did had to do with things I was already interested in, including painting. I'm always doing some sort of research based on curiosity, and there are so many things to discuss here. On this track, I'm not just reacting to something you can't see, and I'm going through the whole story. There will be some spoilers towards the end. The film begins with some rough footage of someone being tortured. Sepia, slow motion and soft focus. This lens that makes the bright areas glow. The lens is also used for flashbacks and other scenes in this film. And then we hear an insane voice recording from the artist in the film. He's saying, among other things, My colors are soft like autumn. They are like fresh blood. He's talking about the colors of autumn and painting death. He's trying to recreate that in human form. This is someone who sounds like he's in a state of psychosis, taking things that artists are talking about and perverting them. Vincent van Gogh said similar things, but he was less homicidal. This recording reminds me of the phone calls in a film called Black Christmas. It's some kind of voice of the subconscious. He's not saying random things. That would be bad filmmaking. This sub-level doesn't just include nice or creative things. This is why some people want to avoid it. The music is not the main theme. This theme is basically for death. The opening sequence is there for a reason. It has so much that can't be explained. You have to see it and hear it. And that is good news when you are making films. We meet our main character, Stefano. He's on a small ferry and it takes him to a village where he is supposed to restore a painting. A young teacher is also on this ferry. Her name is Francesca. They don't know each other yet. According to the director Avati, in this type of film he likes to go from reality to unreality. From the familiar to the unfamiliar. This is his introduction to these characters and this environment. We have everyday interactions and calm atmosphere. Towards the end, these interactions are kept to a minimum. The atmosphere gets denser and darker. This village is a great setting for that, and Stefano is about to be more intimately involved in this strange story. Avati had never made a film like this. He was drawn to some bizarre and unusual stories, and his first film from 1970 had some similar ingredients. So it didn't completely come out of nowhere. It's remarkable how ambitious this whole thing turned out to be. It's the kind of ambition that is not overdone. He wasn't trying too hard to please. He had enough sense not to cash in. It's always exciting when filmmakers realize that they can use their own voice within a specific style, within some limitations. What works in this type of film usually boils down to simplicity and how you are able to use it. Theme is not a term I use often, unless I'm talking about music. Ideas are more tangible and useful. You can have some basic themes, but the result completely depends on the filmmaker. The painting he's restoring is in a church, and the painter Buono Legnani died 20 years ago. We are in the 1950s right now. Everyone is already aware of the painter's disordered mental state. People are mentioning some details, but the main character doesn't know enough to draw any conclusions. He can only react. In this church, Stefano meets a priest, and he runs the show in this small building that was rebuilt many times. It's a nice looking place. No bats flying around. If they made this film now, this place would probably look like Transylvania, and every camera movement would reveal something incredibly ominous. Every inch would be made of horror. I mean the cliched stuff. Here we are invited to a village church. The interior is designed accordingly, and it's the right way to go. It's a place where real people could do some work. The only ominous thing here is that fresco. The painting in question was inspired by the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, who was shot with arrows. This painting looks like a mixture of the Renaissance and the 1970s. Instead of arrows, daggers are sticking out of the bleeding and tortured figure. Stefano doesn't question the painting, but there's this question coming from the priest. Why would anyone want to immortalize such torture in a place of worship? Avati, the director, saw similar paintings growing up. I grew up in a village myself, and the town church had a wooden statue of crucified Christ. I was surprised how much blood was on that statue. This film is about painting, but it's mainly about the act of painting gone wrong. Most filmmakers would never attempt to make anything like this. They would either focus on the painter killing people or follow closely an artist going insane. The house with laughing windows doesn't exactly do either of those things. There's an Italian film called Quiet Place in the Country. In that film by Elio Petri, we see a painter's descent into madness. Buono Legnani, this infamous painter who lived in the village, already has a reputation like that. In the church we also met Lidio, the village idiot, or idiot I should say. He's a bit like the hitchhiker in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but even more easily manipulated. Here we have some more village people, and I don't mean YMCA. This film is horror with some elements from murder mysteries. The Italian term for thrillers and murder mysteries is giallo. In Italian cinema it became its own genre. The main character, Stefano, is played by Lino Capolicchio, and he was also in The Bloodstained Shadow. That film is a tribute to the early 70s giallos. The house with laughing windows is different. Avati had other ideas for his film, and he's able to tell you about the evolution of those ideas. He grew up in the countryside and heard all kinds of stories that planted things in his mind. I grew up with some Italian films, mainly from the 70s and 80s. I also loved reading about them. I read a long article that was heavily illustrated, and my imagination went absolutely wild. I was in my early 20s when I first saw Avati's film. He has made more than 40 of them. I have only seen 4. In 1977 he made All Deceased Except the Dead. It's probably the best parody of Italian murder mysteries. It's like Pink Panther meets Agatha Christie. He didn't want to make typical films. These films were harder to find in the 1990s. And that also fed my imagination and subconscious. When I read short descriptions and saw the posters, I had my own ideas about these films. I'm going to be talking more about them in the future. There are some examples that stood out. Of course, it's better that these films are easier to find now, but people can be extremely cynical. They just say, "Show me that thing right now," and then they just react to it. You don't need imagination in order to react to something. If it's just right in front of you and nowhere else, you're doing a disservice to it. You are only consuming. The whole thing becomes random and trivial. You're watching films from a very self-centered point of view, and you don't have anything to offer. Dreaming about the possibilities means that you need an open mind. It means having an inner world and not apologizing, reacting and money-making will not help you that much. Young people need to think about the possibilities. As a filmmaker or an artist, you have to believe in the possibilities for the rest of your life. And if kids don't have imagination, we are completely screwed. In this scene, we hear about the house with laughing windows for the first time. Stefano was already curious about the painting on the church wall. He's curious about most things related to it. He also thinks he's just here to restore one painting. He's surprised how many times death is mentioned whenever someone is revealing more about the backstory. He is here to uncover things. He might even have a bit of morbid curiosity. If you are interested in these sorts of things, as a filmmaker, you can't really have characters who completely spoil the fun, if you know what I mean. There's an old lady picking flowers. She never says anything. We will eventually know more about her. Those flowers are in the church now. It reminds me of putting flowers on someone's grave. There will be more flowers in other scenes, so I won't say too much about that yet. Stefano received some threats during a phone call. We don't know who that person was, but someone wants him to leave this village. His work is too important to him. What would you do with all those sharp scrapers if you didn't have this job? They would be completely useless. This tortured figure is in the middle of the painting. There's something else on each side. A layer of white build-up is covering whatever is underneath. Someone also said that the image was never completed. It will be completed, one way or another. Time waits for no scraper. One of the people in this village is basically the stereotypical drunk. His name is Coppola. Because of his drinking habits and fighting, the others say that you shouldn't believe anything he says. He's actually one of the least weird characters, and you should believe him. There's something about growing up in this place that made him that way. There's also something about the director's own childhood that inspired this character and the painter. Avati heard stories about artists who sat next to people's deathbeds and painted the sick and the dying. He was horrified when he heard those stories, but it gave him lots of ideas. This film is basically his take on that, his version, and I love that. Those ideas are rooted in reality. It's not something I would want to see in real life. Later in the film, we are going to see a flashback where Buono Legnani is doing just that. Maybe this is how the painter's obsession got started. Stefano is in a room where they have more paintings. They have a similar look. In this scene, there's a different kind of flashback. We see what the painter looked like, and he's using himself as a model for this painting of a nude woman. The filmmakers are already telling us something about the ambiguity between men and women. The painter replaced the woman's face with his own. They say he had no luck with the ladies. It seems like he didn't even want to have any luck. He did have some unusual relationships, and to me he's someone who was probably incapable of having anything else. This is his weirdest painting. It feels spiteful, but oddly melancholy. I don't know if this is the only surviving picture of his face. It does look disturbing. And I almost never use that word. The old lady who was picking flowers received one of these paintings as a gift. So she had some sort of connection with the infamous painter who looks incredibly depressed in every shot. At this point, a character who wanted to inform Stefano falls to his death. It appears he was pushed out of a window. There's a line in one of the earlier scenes about opening windows and finding out what goes on in the village. So many window-related images are being shown to us, usually at crucial points. Avati knows what he's doing. The first character to die on screen is now lying on the ground. If you are watching this for some sort of slasher body count, you are watching the wrong film. Same goes for those who just see this as a murder mystery. 1976 was late for that kind of approach. Avati wasn't that interested in picking different kinds of weapons for psychos. His focus was somewhere else. This scene reminds me of Rosemary's Baby. Someone who had no reason to kill himself is suddenly dead. The authorities come up with all kinds of reasons, but we all know it's BS. Here we even see a shadow behind the curtain. So the main character picks up this clue and starts questioning what is going on. This film is not plot-driven. Everything surrounding it is so striking and recognizable. These are the kinds of films that I'm mainly interested in. The plot is not the most impressive thing here. There's only so much you can do with plot. What happens next is not the most profound question. This film was shot during the spring of 1976. Most locations were in northern Italy. This village can be very beautiful. At this point we still see peaceful shots of the countryside. At the same time, you feel like you are in the middle of nowhere. The artist was talking about the colors of autumn in the beginning. We don't literally see that in this film. It's a great death metaphor, but we don't necessarily need that season for things to happen. It's something that is approaching and is part of the mysterious world of the artist. The main character is with Lidio, the village idiot, who is talking about eating mice. He's a real dingbat supremo. Italians like adding strange characters like this. The main character is in the middle of nowhere, stuck with weird people. They don't always even say anything. They are part of the atmosphere. And they feel more real when they don't look like movie stars. Lidio has a canister, and when Stefano asks about the content, the reply is that it's a secret. There's formaldehyde in that canister, and Lidio probably knows what it's used for. They are here to visit an old woman who is said to be paraplegic. She's not in a wheelchair. She's in bed. There are lots of rooms in this house, and Stefano is going to spend more time here. This house and these interiors create an incredible location. The music in the scene is a variation of the main theme. The score was written by Amedeo Tommasi. One of the instruments is a 70s keyboard organ, and it's used in this powerful main theme that is called the obsessive theme. The music is basically variations of three themes: love, obsession, and death. The soundtrack hasn't been officially released, but at least the main theme has been unofficially available. The score is amazing, and it was created by someone who didn't usually write this type of music. Tommasi was a jazz pianist and a composer. There is also some experimental electronic music that he composed. I'm not sure if he ever really knew that he could write dark music this well. He may have surprised himself, which is good. He certainly knows how to do powerful variations. The music is very unrelenting. It benefits from repetition. The power of repetition in music came from imitating animals in prehistoric times. We were imitating them before we had musical instruments. Avati wrote the majority of this film during the night. I can understand the appeal of that. I'm a night person myself. There's so much night atmosphere, and every second of it belongs there. According to him, atmosphere is one of the main elements in a film like this. He clearly also has visual ideas, and you always need those. Stefano is in this house with someone who is immobile, but he hears noises all around him. The director himself heard similar sounds. There's one room in this house that we haven't seen yet. One of my favorite short stories is called The Night. It was written by Guy de Maupassant. It opens with the line, "I love the night with passion." In that story we are wandering at nighttime and feeling how signs of life slowly become more distant. The story is also called The Nightmare. The same writer also came up with a great story called Fear. Fear of the unknown is one of the main themes. The paraplegic woman implies that she doesn't get many visitors, but Stefano notices the same kinds of flowers that were in the church. This woman is almost like those dying people who were once visited by the deathbed painters. And Stefano probably feels sorry for her, but things are not what they seem. Her name is going to be mentioned eventually. Avati is good at saving one thing for a specific scene. He doesn't repeat the same thing over and over again, or constantly explain things. This world has been polluted with explanations. It has to do with lowering the bar and many other things. You can talk about ideas without explaining everything, without worshipping information. And things are also being explained badly. That word is now overrated. The word explain. Information can't give you everything. It can't exactly tell you how you should feel. And now we have artificial intelligence doing things for us, explaining things. And if you think that everything should be explained for some mass audience, I've got bad news for you. There is no mass audience. And information online is not enough. It's not there to guide your every step. It's more about selling things. You can always brainwash yourself into believing that you are part of some mass audience, but it won't help you in any way. The question is, would you like to raise the bar yourself? Stefano is exploring the house he's staying in. He wants to know what is in those other rooms. The sound design is minimal but effective. Silence is broken by sounds from other rooms and the noises he's making while he's opening a door. He doesn't want others to find out what he's doing. Sound design and soundtracks started changing in the 1950s. We don't hear music yet. The sounds in this house could also be something we hear in films about haunted houses. The Innocents from 1961 is a film by Jack Clayton. The haunted house soundscape was surprisingly modern and included processed electronic tones and voices that were echoing all around. Sound design makes us wonder about the source of those sounds. In this film, the soundscape is a mixture of natural and more unrecognizable sounds. Stefano finds the so-called painting room. The sounds in this room mainly come from objects. He discovers where some of those noises in the night are coming from. During this whole film, things are being planted in his mind. The director's own experiences are connected to those ideas, but also the way he developed them. We are at the point where Stefano is starting to doubt his own sanity. But as we go further, he's becoming more and more certain about the actual events, and it's everyone else who is questioning his theories. This is the tape recorder scene. Stefano finds an old tape recorder in the painting room. He plugs it in. A flame comes out of the wiring, and the lights suddenly turn off. He's surrounded by darkness, and the tape starts playing. This is the same voice recording from the opening sequence. The wind opens a window, and the curtains start waving around. There's a bulb on the recorder, and this gives us just enough light. Avati writes and imagines things that are on the furthest edge of probability. His love for atmosphere and visual ideas makes this moment incredibly memorable. I end up enjoying the scene and not questioning the sequence of events. Some people just ask what happens next. I love how these filmmakers play around with that question. I cannot tell you how much this scene turns me on. What I love about this film is that the painter is not a great person. If we reflect on our own problems at the same time, without too much self-satisfaction, we can find ourselves in some interesting places. You can learn something. Of course, it's important to know what creativity means to a sane person. But madness is where humanity is. If you're not someone who only looks at landscapes, you're going to find these themes worthy of studying. It's important to recognize it. We already know something the main character doesn't. The film began with dreamlike footage of torture. Stefano heard about this painter of death. He heard the voice on this tape talking about painting death, purification, and about someone else who is dying. One of my favorite quotes is from S.I. Hayakawa, who wrote about language in thought and action. The quote is, "The meanings of words are not in the words, they are in us." The painter is taking advantage of ambiguity. The meaning of a word is something we feel, and it has to do with our relationship with other people. You also show the meaning with your actions. The painter is so obsessed with his own delusions that he doesn't know the value of sanity anymore. He has given up. He thinks he's a destructive force of nature. Stefano hasn't exactly given up yet. The people who hired him basically left him alone. If you have multiple assignments, something like this will eventually happen. No one around you is being helpful. Stefano is pleased with his restoration work. He has managed to uncover most of the original church painting. This tortured figure with daggers sticking out of him is surrounded by two people. Two long-haired people with aggressive expressions on their faces. They are dressed in white. This is a great image. The representation in the painting and the real-life inspiration in the story. I don't think I've ever seen that exact image anywhere else. It does remind me of something. The inspiration for the painting was Saint Sebastian, who was shot with arrows. But there's no one standing next to him, at least in the paintings I've seen. They are performing funeral rites. The old lady who was picking flowers is in the church now. Lydia says he put a live mouse inside the coffin in front of them. And then the mouse starts making a noise. This is a great way of suggesting that the dead are coming back to life. Stefano hasn't completely realized the amount of weird things going on in the village. He thinks the painting is a breath of fresh air. Two women are torturing the saint. There's another scene in daylight with soft focus. This glowing effect is hinting at things that are about to unfold. The priest has been oddly dismissive about the painting. It's in a building where he runs the show, and he wants things to be restored. In a way, he's asking questions that the audience would be asking, but at the same time, he's remaining silent about some other things. Our main character, Steve, is approaching this house where he's staying, and the sound of the voice recording is coming from one of the rooms. Or maybe he's just hearing things. Maybe someone who was said to be dead is not really dead. It turns out that Francesca, the young teacher, has also been listening to that tape with the recording on it. She thinks it's a bunch of nonsense. Francesca is both the name of the character and the name of the actress, Francesca Marciano. She's a writer and she has only appeared in about 5 feature films, including All Deceased Except the Dead, Avati's mystery parody. She has some more lines in that film. Here she's telling more about herself, and we find out that she has already known some of these strange characters for a while. Stefano and Francesca have been exchanging looks throughout the film, and it's quite predictable that they would eventually know each other more intimately. Italian horror films almost never have love scenes. They usually have less everyday interactions, and love scenes were more typical in the Italian murder mysteries. Many of the Italian directors were born during the first half of the 20th century, and they were influenced by classics, specifically the ones that are more visual and include scenes one might call unreal. They were not thinking about love stories, or at least the stereotypical ones. If the film benefits from footage showing two characters getting together, go ahead and put it in. I think there's a good reason for some of these moments here. The romantic love theme is playing during this scene. It's associated with these two characters. This is by far the nicest sequence in the whole film. This scene gets 2 thumbs up from me. It really does. This scene is supposed to be the opposite of everything that is obscene and unspeakable in this story. This is supposed to be an example of something good. There is a sense that everyone gets tempted, that people can't resist temptation. But it's not that simple. The obscene behavior by some characters is described in an indirect way. This film doesn't really wallow in that sort of stuff. Things are being contrasted in this film. Two sides are right next to each other. The nice things are found closer to the surface level. This whole village can be seen as an example of that. Someone is interested in that other side. Maybe even bored with all the nice things on the surface. Flowers, smiles, and laughter are used in a misleading way in this film. At the end, the lights are turned off, but the radio is still radiating some light. A bit like that tape recorder we just saw. Whenever we see a love scene with the main characters, we automatically assume that something terrible is about to happen. In this case, we are right about that. Welcome to the middle of the film. That's from Monty Python's Meaning of Life. Painting death was the meaning of life for our painter Buono. Also welcome to the middle of nowhere. The main character is now investigating abandoned houses. During daytime. So many old houses here, and they can also be beautiful. Some of them were demolished soon after they finished shooting. I have been to northern Italy once. I was not lucky enough to be around these locations. Coppola, the informative guy who also drinks a lot, gives Stefano a lift and starts talking about the painter's background and his own history in this village. This could be one of the few friendships Coppola has had, at least in recent times. He wants someone to understand him. He has a very emotional personality, and that reminds me of Caravaggio, the Renaissance painter. Coppola probably doesn't know much about art. Stefano wants to help. That's part of his personality. The painter used to live in Brazil. He couldn't find any success there, so he moved here. Ever since then, he was incredibly isolated. Legnani had two sisters who apparently had some weird obsessions before the painter started losing his mind. Some of this is quite stereotypical stuff when it comes to artists. The lack of money, mental problems. There's enough mystique so that things are left to the imagination. It can be a dangerous way of life. Apparently these siblings took that to a whole other level. Coppola remembers his mother's illness and Legnani sitting next to his mother's deathbed, painting a portrait. We are seeing women dressed in white during a flashback. They look like nurses. Their faces don't look familiar. These shots are here to remind us of those two women in the church painting. I admire the filmmakers who made this film. I don't admire the artist who lost his marbles. He could have been something else, but his obsessions consumed him. Those obsessions don't care about categories or labels. It doesn't matter what you call yourself. Creators of dark art are trying to understand something. They don't just give up. One of my favorite artists is Francisco de Goya. His darker paintings are easily his best works. A famous quote from him reads, "Fantasy abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters." His point was that fantasy should be united with reason, so that you don't just do something weird for the sake of doing it. If you keep doing that, you will become a fruitcake, abandoned by raisins. The director of this film didn't just do that. He knows what some of these experiences feel like, and the main thing about art is the way it feels. He knows how to run with ideas. He doesn't celebrate too early. One idea leads to another. Some filmmakers now are running with ideas like thieves run with stolen merchandise. Try to avoid that. There's a big problem with opportunism. Creativity should be about something else. Here's my question. Why do you want to be an artist? Or a filmmaker? These days, there's a whole thing about people wanting to be creatives. What I mean by that is the person who does these things, but they don't really want it for the right reasons. You have to be an art lover first. Start with that. It's harder to fail in that. My own DNA is part of the reason why I'm an artist. But you can have interesting ideas even without that. I mean, if you don't just see it as a money-making thing, there's another big problem. Interesting ideas have to do with risk-taking within legal limits. I have to admit, when I see the works of artists these days, I'm sometimes thinking, could you lose your mind, please? It would be an improvement. It doesn't have to be a mental breakdown. I just want to see them struggle. Let's use that word. Let's dial back our sadism. Speaking of sadism, Stefano is reading more about the painter's sisters. He found some notes that mention people who are described as models in a very morbid way. The notes mention formaldehyde and the painter's grave. There's also something about sacrificial communion, rites based on human sacrifice, contacting the deceased through these practices. Some of this could be Stefano's own interpretation, Francesca clearly realizes that there's no turning back. They have to do something, which would mean abandoning their assignments. There's an old photo of the sisters, and it was taken in Brazil. We don't get much information about what exactly went on in Brazil. What we learn is that it was something incredibly violent and sexual, and it's something they continued when they relocated. This is the moment when our main character is convinced. He has to find out who they are. Getting one piece of information at a time can drive you insane. And I'm not just talking about what I'm doing right now. There's a possibility that he's being paranoid throughout this whole film. It's something we see a lot in horror films. The idea that these two sisters are driving people mad is in some ways affecting Stefano. Every story and clue is feeding his imagination. He was always curious, but he doesn't quite know how this is going to end. The curiosity of the filmmakers is reflected on the characters. I think the film is more interesting when things are actually happening. The main character is not just imagining it. Going back to what they said about communicating with the dead, this is something Avati explored in his other films. I'm mainly referring to spiritism, psychic powers, and finding means to resurrect the dead. He clearly gravitates towards these ideas whenever he was formulating this type of project. This is not a supernatural film, even though the atmosphere and some of the images are reminiscent of that. Avati didn't just want to make horror films. Whenever he made one, he included many unusual elements. They could be too unusual for some, but I think they are essential. These opportunities were too good to resist. We look for different things in horror films. As I get older, I cannot overstate how much I appreciate films like this. Then there are films that are hard to categorize. The horror label is used quite freely. If there's a film that is vaguely in that sort of area, people tend to use the horror label immediately. I haven't made a horror film myself. I guess one day I might have to. In any case, cinema is a creative medium, and to me, it's really about the ideas. Stefano and the priest agree that there's something fishy to say the least, about this whole situation. The priest says he's getting rid of that painting soon. There's always this sense of secrecy. We don't know exactly what to believe when people are telling stories. They think they shouldn't reveal too much about their connections to the painter. The old lady who was picking flowers and who also received one of the paintings as a gift was once in love with Buono Legnani. They say that the painter's mental state was so dismal that doctors were going to hospitalize him no matter what. The painter apparently set himself on fire in front of this woman who had feelings for him. His body was never found. He disappeared into the night. Legnani lived in his own world. This woman who once loved him chose not to believe all the horrible things that were said about him. The painter probably thought of himself as some sort of martyr. He made everything about himself. It says presumed dead on the official records. This relationship Stefano has with the painter, or at least the idea of the painter, is complicated. The audience is going to compare them. He keeps thinking about the painter in different ways, both positively and negatively. He's got his thinking face on, almost half the film. Stefano's own mental state is also highlighted many times, but I think the film avoids most of the worst cliches. We see that someone has decided to destroy parts of the church painting. The faces of the two women are gone. Things are about to unravel in this final act. Someone knows too much. Those two figures cannot be shown in the painting anymore. They are about to step into reality, or the kind of reality we are shown. Someone dressed in white is also creeping around. No one is safe. The painting was vandalized with a chemical substance. Stefano's investigations are not over yet. He is trying to find out where the substance came from and who used it. He's discussing leaving the village with Francesco. They both feel trapped. They go back and forth with emotional appeals and accusations. Stefano is trying to convince her, but also himself. They both have different reasons. There's an unusual amount of time dedicated to this relationship. When I first saw this film, I didn't realize how strong some of these scenes were. It makes their struggles more real and intensifies the emotional impact of what is about to happen. Relationships in Italian horror films are usually so much more dysfunctional. For many reasons, the house with laughing windows is a hybrid. In some ways it reminds me of the 1960s. It has to do with the inclusion of visual arts. Avati started working on a script or treatment in the early 70s. Some of these ideas came from oral tradition and folk tales. He didn't pay much attention to Italian horror at the time. He was a fan of Federico Fellini and Carl Dreyer. Dreyer used some techniques that inspired the soft focus look in a selection of scenes. When they were making those older films, almost 100 years ago, they didn't have that same lens. They used some kind of fabric with holes in it. It was like a filter. Even though Stefano, our art restoration champion, is determined to leave this village as soon as possible, he can't resist asking about the chemical that was sold to the person who decided to censor some images in the church. He never gets an answer. All he hears is that several people bought the same acid. Lidio makes a quick appearance. Perhaps he needs more formaldehyde. Whatever it is, he is up to no good. We are going to meet Coppola again. He has been the driver in so many scenes, which is quite remarkable since he consumes alcohol constantly. We see some of the last beautiful shots of this village. Would I like to live there? Maybe only in my fantasies. We hear more about Coppola's story. He says he's not allowed to drive anymore. There are hints suggesting that he's not allowed to speak anymore. Coppola is very much a part of this village now, whether he likes it or not. Like something that is growing out of the ground, simultaneously watering and killing himself. Long time ago, he saw what the painter's sisters did. All that suffering and bloodshed in those paintings was based on torture and murder in real life. Now he wants Stefano to know that they are still here. There's a line about curious people losing their minds. This is something that the audience has already picked up, but the line is here to remind us of this relationship between these two characters. There is tension and urgency at the same time. Someone also opens a window when Coppola finally decides to speak his mind. They don't have much time left. We are seeing some kind of evidence buried in the ground. Evidence in the form of human remains. The director of this film heard a story about a priest who died and whose bones were later examined. They found out the priest's true identity. These bones we see in the ground came from someone else. Avati used different elements from that story and wrote his own vision. Running with ideas usually means connecting things in interesting ways. You don't have to think too hard about those connections. Sometimes your mind will work on that silently and intuitively. Association is part of that as well. Your subconscious mind is always listening. You have to learn how to listen to it. Atmosphere is also about connecting things. Everyone is capable of that, but not everyone appreciates it. Atmosphere is not really about the facts. It's the feeling you get from combinations of things. I always appreciate that. You could call me an atmosphere junkie. When I fantasized about horror films growing up, I didn't have to worry about anything. As a filmmaker, you need to know some basics about stories and writing. You need a voice. These films are a good way to learn more about the limits of filmmaking, besides the basics. Atmosphere is not just escapism, it is a creative challenge. The same goes for revealing things slowly and playing around with visual ideas. As Stefano and Coppola are digging for evidence in front of an old house, Francesca is being attacked by Lidio. He unleashes his idiotic libido. Did we expect anything else from him? He was singing a song about horse in an earlier scene. Maybe these are his fantasies. Or escapism, who knows? We are going to see the back of this house now. Here it is. The house with laughing windows. It took 84 minutes to get here. It was first mentioned 70 minutes ago, and we have been thinking about it this whole time. Avati saved this image for these scenes. We have been thinking about the meaning of the laughing windows. The laughing reminds me of opening the blinds. The blinds are open and moving. It also has to do with an open secret. What is inside the house and how the outside world sees it. It's the kind of visual idea that is memorable but mysterious. It's a metaphor we can see. When you have a metaphor for something else, you only show the image that includes the metaphor. There's enough here so that we get a sense of the surroundings. The painted smiles on those windows are interesting by themselves, but they don't exist as a separate image. Something completely detached. These are crazy smiles. The painter's life was not filled with genuine laughter. He needed paintings as some kind of manic, energetic representation. The smiles on the windows give the painter an afterlife. Stefano is looking for Francesca. He arrives at the house where he was staying. The old woman in the bed is not there anymore. He goes into the painting room and finds Francesca's dead body tied up. Her hands were tied the same way as the other person in the opening sequence. She's hanging from the ceiling. The romantic love theme repeats. He hears some weird sounds, like footsteps and breathing. The sounds could also be coming from the ropes and the thing in the ceiling, as Francesca's body is slightly moving from side to side. There's fresh blood on the floor. Coppola has disappeared. The last 15 minutes of the film are going to be quite unreal as promised. Things are escalating. And you could say that things should escalate a bit faster. This film is not perfect. I'm referring to some of the earlier scenes. I wouldn't change this film that much. The momentum could benefit from speeding up. Once again, the police is here, this time with rifles. knowing that there are multiple creeps creeping around, doing things in secret. It's obvious that the crime scenes have been cleaned. The authorities will not find anything that proves the murder of Francesca or anyone buried in the ground. Stefano is already thinking that some people must be trying to keep things hidden. The police are always eager to dismiss everything he says. He is also under suspicion. He's an outsider. The way things develop doesn't put him in a place that is credible from everyone else's point of view. We hear some night atmosphere sound design. Sounds from natural sources. The only musical cues are quiet, and they are placed at key moments, mainly when Stefano reacts to all these frustrating and weird situations. Dramatic music is used carefully in this film. Variations of the death and obsession themes usually repeat. The darkness in the music is clear, but eerie at the same time. We see a human jaw bone on the ground. Either no one noticed it, or it was ignored deliberately. Coppola's body is found near the river. The police and the man who hired Stefano don't seem that shocked or surprised. He apparently has some scars on his chest and torso area. You can get scars like that if you have been cut with a knife. He may have been a victim of the two sisters. Those look like old scars, so it happened closer to his childhood. He of course was traumatized by what happened when he was a child, and it led to a very unhealthy life. He is just another villager with secrets. It was suggested that his drinking habit wasn't entirely caused by one trauma. Some people kept giving him more alcohol. Things are not looking good for Stefano either. Everything is arranged in a way that could incriminate the main character. He gets the blame. I have seen this trope many times This sometimes happens when there's a horror film that is more intelligent. It's hard to explain. There's a relationship between the main character and the unknown. Whatever is causing all the harm. You could also call it the unexplained. We hear Francesca's pre-recorded voice during a phone call. It's played so that Stefano would go back to the house. Here we go. Time for some unveilings, revelations, and things of that nature. The obsessed will find out what goes on in that room where the noises in the night were coming from, where the tape recorder was found, the painting room, the place of torture, and of course fresh blood. If you keep looking for something forbidden and monstrous, don't be surprised if it's suddenly right in front of you. Stefano wants to solve things, but he's faced with two completely insane muses. He's very much still reacting. He was doing that in the beginning, when these stories about the painter started filling his mind. This is in some ways what he wanted to see. The sisters are here, stabbing Lidio to death. The old lady who was in that bed is now dressed like a nurse, walking around and stabbing together with her counterpart. Let's see what is in that closet. It's the painter's remains, kept in a tank filled with formaldehyde. These rituals of agony still continue. Invocations of death and flowing colors. The director isn't doing that much to create this unreal, mesmerizing scene. He's so good at doing this. He's able to reveal things slowly instead of trying to make you jump with quick and loud shots. These evil muses are telling us exactly what is going on. There's so much pride and confidence. If you want to experiment with writing, write dialogue or a monologue for an insane person. Find out who you really are. Stefano is being chased by these maniacs after the other one stabbed him. No music, just the sound of a wind and some animals. He is wounded, overpowered, and exposed to the elements. Surrounded by darkness and homicidal aggression. No choice but to hide and wait. He has to tell someone else again. Maybe this time someone who possesses different kind of authority. We haven't seen that priest in a while. I wonder what his reaction will be. What would it take to convince him? There seems to be no one else left. No one else believes the main character anymore. People go missing, things disappear, and he's always conveniently there. He is no longer welcomed like he was in the beginning. The same music is playing, but all we see in people's faces is disappointment and rejection. The powers that be are worried about the reputation of this place. They are also fighting with each other. Investigations don't usually go so well, which is typical for this type of film. If you're looking for some kind of heroic ending where everything is solved, resolved and explained, you are watching the wrong film. Let's see if this priest can do any good in this situation. Stefano is trying to explain everything, but he's becoming so delirious, squeezing that wound that is still bleeding. The priest doesn't look convinced or worried. Then his voice slightly changes. The reveal at the end is still powerful, and it was when I first saw it. This film is not about how quickly you can guess the ending. Again, it is a slower reveal. She is the other sister, and she's singing the same song the old lady in the bed was singing in an earlier scene. Avati had this character in mind when he started writing this film. Once again there's a story he heard that inspired this reveal. There was a priest who died. The bones were later examined, and they found out that she was a woman who had always kept her true identity a secret. The sister we already know is here as well. Her name is Laura, and she looks absolutely terrifying. This is the right kind of ending. There are some strong images, with the eerie main theme returning. This is the end of this commentary as well. Sweet dreams. Sweeter nightmares.